morning. So I want to introduce you to Casey. He's the guy who's doing all the nitrogen work. So I just want to give a shout out to him. And he's often here on the shore, going to different farm fields, collecting samples, analyzing, and then just giving me the data back so I can give a talk. So thank you, Casey. I also want to thank other people in my group who have been working on a lot of interconnected projects on nitrogen, phosphorus, and carbon, the three sort of things that we work in Maryland and which are important to us. So what I'm going to do today is really simple. So we'll touch on some backgrounds and talk about a lot of nitrogen in corn, and then we'll spend quite a bit of time talking about a soil nitrogen project that we started working with MDA about 2 years ago. And we have some data coming in, so happy to share what we have so far. So just sort of context, we are in Chesapeake Bay watershed, like everyone knows that. And what I'm going to show you is, according to EPA, how much nitrogen leaves different areas of state of Maryland. So you're looking at a green, which is agriculture. This is all agricultural land in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, and you see the size of that. The next is the dwelled area, which is all urban area. So if you look at the map here, those reds will be DC, Baltimore, and yellow will be the agriculture area. But what's actually more important is, Jenny. So this is a total nitrogen loss by each county. So according to their estimates in Maryland, where we are, we lose about 20 pounds per acre of nitrogen. And this is also an economic loss. You all know fertilizers are not cheap. Like, you didn't add fertilizers to run off from the field, but that's the nature of agriculture. So that number is important, and we have some other estimates on how much we lose. Similarly, if we look at total phosphorus, again, we look into that. And what you see is that error, that there are a lot of BMPs that have been implemented in the watersheds, but our nitrogen and phosphorus losses have not been reduced to an extent we want them to be reduced. So that's part of the challenge. If you look in terms of economically, we only lose a pound of phosphorus, which is really tiny, like from the soils if you compare with the nitrogen. And this is also the nature of nutrients, that you really need small amount of phosphorus to cause algal blooms in different places. So very different chemistry of these two nutrients and how they behave in the farms. You all know that nitrogen management is challenging. It's complicated, right? And part of the reason is that there's no direct soil test to measure amount of nitrogen, so you can tailor your recommendations. There's also tremendous variability in the fields and even within the fields. And most of the nitrogen cycling is also controlled by microorganisms in the soil, which makes it really challenging and complicated. So when we think about complexity, there are two sort of main factors that make nitrogen management really challenging. So the first factor is how much nitrogen will be contributed by soil. That's really challenging and difficult to predict in different fields. Each field has a different story. And this means nitrogen mineralization, how much nitrogen could be contributed by soil naturally, cover crops, and then manure contribution. The second sort of factor is how much of nitrogen and when will be used by the crops. So this is like synchronizing nitrogen application with when plants need. So think of us, we need 3 meals, right? We can't eat 1 meal and get by. So in case of plants, that's part of the challenge, to make sure that that nitrogen is available when the plants need it. That's really difficult to do that. There are some opportunities to work on it. Split applications are good. In that case, you're splitting the meal into few components. So some of our ongoing research is looking at those two complexity questions, 1 and 2, that we're going to dig into that today a little bit. When you think about how corn uses nitrogen, you may probably have seen this graph somewhere. What you are seeing is, this is when you planted, and this is when you harvested, and this is how much of the total nitrogen is taken by corn. So in the first part, when corn is growing, we know that's where most of the nitrogen is used. In fact, about 60% is used. So an example will be, if your yield goal is 200 bushels, you're probably adding 200 pounds, and 60% of that will be 120 pounds used. And the rest of that will stay there if all the nitrogen is added as a pre-plant. And there's a long season. Rains, other things will cause that nitrogen loss to occur. So that's why split applications are really useful. The second component is what we call the second phase. This is where nitrogen is, the blue will be the grain. That's where we really want the nitrogen to go, is taken up. So in this example of the same, you need to have about 80 pounds at this point for crop to utilize. And in some years, it works because we didn't get enough rain. But in many years, we get a lot of rain that causes loss of this nitrogen. So if you also think about daily, how much nitrogen is taken by corn from an acre field. And this number is really tiny, 1 to 3 pounds per acre. So this, again, reinforces the idea of splitting the meal over a period of time, if possible, to make sure that nitrogen is there when the crop needs it. So I'm just going to walk through a few slides here, and then we'll talk about that. So as sort of corn starts growing, you see this sort of behavior. This is the first phase, what I call the teenager phase. This is where they're hungry. That's where they need a lot of nutrients to grow, about 60% at this point. And the critical time period is somewhere at these leaf to the tillering stage. Now, the second page, the adulthood phase, that's where they will use about 40%. And again, now you're, in this case, the nitrogen is going to the grain, either the new uptake and also translocation. So as you sort of get later into the crop, you see all these leaves are turning yellow. It's because nitrogen from the lower part is moving to the grain, which is really good. And that's what we want. So here is 40% of the total, and also the translocation or movement of nitrogen from the lower part of the plant to the grain, and that's what we want. So now, when you think about corn, how does corn get nitrogen in a farm field? So just like how do we get our meal? Go raid the fridge, go to a restaurant. So in case of corn, there are 3 ways the roots will get, the crop will get that nitrogen. So first is what's called root interception, which means the root is growing and it bumps into nitrogen that's there, fertilizer, manure, or whatever that might be. And the other will be what's called flow. So where there's enough water in the soil, that's where nitrogen will become available and it will move towards the root. That's the second pathway. The third pathway is diffusion, which means place from higher concentration where you applied to other parts movement. So that's the third way. When you look at corn, most of the nitrogen actually goes with water. So this also is an important point, that you can have a lot of fertilizer, but if there is not enough moisture or water in the soil, that nitrogen won't be available and utilized by corn. That's the one point. Look at phosphorus, is very different. So in case of phosphorus, it will move where you added to a lower part. And that's why the banding of phosphorus application is critical, so you can add that close to the roots. That's part of the sort of goal here. So what's our current approach to nitrogen recommendations in the state and in many other states in the country? So first is base recommendation. We have a yield goal approach here, which means you have a yield goal. And in this example, if your yield goal is 200 bushels, and then you add about 200 pounds, or in other words, 1 pound per bushel. There are exceptions, of course, but this is an example. And then you sort of subtract. So if your nutrient management advisor is asking you about all the questions with legume cover crops, they're actually trying to calculate how much nitrogen could potentially be contributed. So once they have that information, they can help you figure out the final application rate. Again, this is based on the yield goal, that potentially what could be coming from the soil and what you need to add. So the project that we are working with MDA is we are sort of looking at that how good our recommendations are for nitrogen. And secondly, do we need to tweak or modify those recommendations. So that's the goal of the project. So when you think about what are the factors that will affect nitrogen availability and recommendation, so a couple of things here. Soils, high organic matter means more nitrogen, and so will the soil texture. A sandy soil versus a heavy soil. Drainage is also very critical in this scheme of things, because nitrogen cycle is hugely influenced by how much water you have. And also the residue, manure, cover crops, and other things. The second component here is the crop needs, and this is the second part, the synchronizing your application with the needs. And is it all early season, or is it split application where you're side dressing? And the third one gets really complicated, how much soil will release, how much will be lost in different ways. So when you're trying to figure out a nitrogen application, you can see many of these factors are going to differ in different fields. Mid-shore is going to be very different than lower shore, or this area will be very different than the western shore. And that's why those recommendations are really challenging to have universal recommendations for every single field same, because of different variability. So typically, when researchers are working on recommendations, this is the sort of a process that they use. First is you select the sites. I'm sure some of you have been contacted, either farmers field, research farms. There's an experimental design. Field is divided into small plots. Then different nitrogen rates are applied. And they are interested in getting information about the yield from your fields with different application rates. And then they're looking at something like this. And this means how much was added and what was the yield. Anyone see a problem with this approach? Knowing what we know about nitrogen, that this approach does not take into consideration any of the climate data. That's one part of the problem. Rainfall, temperature is different each year, every week, every day. The second is the soil properties are not considered. And these have huge influence in terms of nitrogen. Some of these factors do affect other phosphorus and potassium, but to lesser extent than they do with nitrogen. So I'm going to jump into and talk about the soil nitrogen project. So here, when we were sort of thinking about how to do that, the usual suspect is let's do crop response trials, because that's something we have always done. So we wanted to take a different approach and see if there is a better way to think about recommendations. So the first thing was, okay, we're not going to go and do crop response trials. You're going to need thousands of those to figure out. And again, there's a variability. So we were asking this question, bottoms-up approach, what I call, that if you're growing corn in a field, is there enough nitrogen in the soil to supply to the crop? That's the question we were looking at. So in other words, can we figure out the nitrogen that could potentially be available in different fields? And we know how much corn takes up. And if we know that pool, then we are probably doing okay. So this is where we were exploring that dynamic, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. So what are we doing here? So if you look at nitrogen in any field, where are you going to find that? You're going to find that in the plant. You're also going to find in the residue. But most of the nitrogen is going to be in the soil if you go to any field, right? And then each year you have new applications, and that's your fertilizer or manure. So it gets messy trying to figure out where is nitrogen, when is there, and how much is there. So the question we were interested here was, if we know how much is here, we know how much plants need, then that could be one strategy that we could use as we move forward in the other phases of this project. So we started this project in 2023, and in the first year, we sort of selected sites. We're going from Frederick, and here is PG County, and here we are in Caroline, and they all were corn fields at that year. And last year, since we have corn and soy rotation, some of those corn fields got transitioned to soy. So we added few other sites where you're seeing those red colors pop up, and there's another one. So we've been messing around with these different farms, trying to better understand the management system to sort of better get a handle on nitrogen in different places. And again, this is just a visual of you all. One thing I want to point out is look at the slope. So as you go from Frederick to here, it gets more flat. And that's the question of drainage and aeration that has a huge influence on nitrogen availability in the field. So what have we been doing? What Casey has been doing was that the field that we selected, he was taking a sample before anything is planted. And then he goes when corn is planted and at different sort of stages. And then we go into different, and then we take an end of the year sample. So we've been trying to sample 6 or 7 times in the season, just to sort of better understand or compartmentalize where the nitrogen is in the different places in the field. Like, so this is back the sort of a cycle. So I'm gonna show where we have been sampling. So in 2023, all those red dots are where we took samples on those fields. And then in 24, we also went on different cases. So what we're trying to do with this project is actually keep building this. Eventually, if possible, I would like to take sample every day in the field, but you all know that's not possible because that will be a really good way to see how much is there each day. But we are trying to sort of maximize this in a way that we can, just to better learn that rather than taking a sample in the beginning or at the end, if we go various times in the year, we will have a better understanding of where the nitrogen is, how is this being cycled and moved in different compartments. Like so, when Casey goes to each of the field, this is what he does. So it's coming back. So this is an example of a field we have. So our sampling strategy that we are using is we sort of have these crop circles that we draw arbitrarily on a piece of paper. And then from each circle, Casey starts sampling. So for example, first sampling, he will go to this area. This is where the corn will be, and he will take a lot of samples. Second time, he will move to the second one. So the idea is we want to stay in the area which is uniform in growth. And this is one way to minimize variability that might exist. And we have sort of 3 different places in the field to capture that variability. And then he has this 5 square feet rectangle that he uses. So pretty much in the case of plant samples, he will harvest the plant's residue. He will remove all the residue. Then he will take the soil sample, bring it back, and then we do different analysis. And some of the data that is ongoing, data analysis, but I'm going to share with you some of the soil data that we are collecting. Also some of the plant data, and this is different plants growing over period of time. So again, the question we are interested in, where and how much nitrogen is in the corn soy fields. That's the question that's guiding this research. So precipitation is a driver for many things for plants to successfully grow. What you are seeing is about 40 years of data, like average rainfall. So here I'm only showing the data for Caroline County, which is next to you. So if you look at average rainfall 40 years from 1981 to 21, you had about 17 inches of rainfall, right? If we look into the last 3 years, 21 to 23, it varies, 45 to 50. So in other words, if you go in a field, you're going to have about 4-inch variability in the rainfall. So keep that in mind, that in each year, in the last 3, it varied about 4 inches. What does that mean? If you have a 1 inch of rainfall in 1 acre, that will add about 27,000 gallons of water. So that's a lot of water. And just if you have 2-3 inches, which means that field got a lot less water, that also means it's going to affect the nutrients that exist there and how they are cycled back and available to the plants. Now let's dig into the rainfall data because this gets interesting. So if we look at the last 40 years of data, And these are what you're seeing is we have 15 different sites around state of Maryland where we have access to this data. So the first question we were asking was, is rainfall increasing in Maryland in the last 40 years? And we know the answer, no, it's not increasing. What has been increasing is the maximum amount of rain that you get in a day. So for example, in the 10-year time period, the rainfall, you might be getting 2 inches, for example, 10 years ago. And that rainfall now, in over 10-year period, might be 2.5 inches in one day, right? But in the next day, it will be more dry. So that's part of the challenge. And I'm sure you all see that how dry was last year. Like we got a lot less rain. And this is part of the challenge that plants need water along with the nutrients. And if there's not enough water, we need to do something about this. So let's separate this total. What if we separate into what I call growing season from April to October? And you see like bumps go back, but in the last few years, it's been declining. And we observed that we are getting less rain into that seasonal time when crop needs it. Again, declining. When we look into November over winter time period, we don't see any difference. It has been same. And what that means is we are getting sort of more variability and also less rain. That doesn't mean the total amount is different. It's just getting shifted into different places. And that's part of the sort of challenge with the nutrients. So I'm going to show this video. This is from a Caroline County farm where we have been doing a lot of research. And so we're going to spend the next few minutes actually talking about this field. As you can see, this is ditch, and this is a time lapse over 3-day time period. So as it's raining, you never saw water moving over the ditch. You all know that that's not how water moves here, right? So it gets into these. You probably also saw some water standing, and this is where you have a depressional area in the field. That's where the tile drainage is. We need to get the water out in order to grow that. So the field, it's about 140 acres farm that we have been working for the last several years. So I'm going to talk about this field. I don't remember the acreage. Is it 10 acres, something like that? Yeah. So the farm management in this case is, this also uses dairy manure. Farmer is very progressive. This also has a central pivot irrigation system. So this will be under irrigated agriculture. So this field we're going to talk about is silage. On the other side of the field, he had corn grain. So today I'm going to tell a story about the corn silage, and we're going to talk about this field. All right. So let's look into the last 2 years. So you see blue and you see red. Blue is 23 data, and this is monthly rainfall. So each month, how much rainfall happened in that farm. Like, so let's break it down a little bit more. What do we see from January to April? We see higher number in the red, which is 24. Last year, we got about 6 inches more rainfall during January to April. What about summer? We got 5 inches less rainfall in summer in the same field. What about winter? So in winter again, last winter has been very dry. We got very little rain. So this is the part of the shift in the rainfall pattern. So if you add that total in this example, so 23 total rainfall was about 48 inches. The long-term average, the 40-year in this area is about 47, so very similar. When you look at the last year rainfall was actually 7 inches less than the previous year. And that's going to cause some impact if you don't have irrigation on the field. So again, 1 inch rainfall, 27,000 gallons. So that's a lot of water that this field in 24 did not get. And where it didn't get was, this is the time period we are most interested in, summer. And in winter is also important depending on what you are growing in the field. Okay? What about the daily? So this is like each day of 2023 and 2024, how much rainfall you have. So the bottom graph is 23 and the other is 24. So let's dig into this. So here we are looking at a corn, the silage. This is what the farmer had. I'll talk about management. So this was planted June 1, harvested September 26, Total rainfall in 23 during this time period, about 18 inches. Looking into 24, planted 24, also silage, harvested September, 10 inches rain, right? So by 8 inches less rainfall. But there's a central pivot irrigation, so the farmer did irrigate about 4 inches. So if you look at the net deficit of water was about 4 inches in 2024 in that field. So what if we didn't have irrigation system? That would be different, that would be challenging. But in this case, he had that. And if you look, this was the dry period. So August, September was very dry, and that's when the irrigation occurred in this field. Okay, let's talk about management. So this is going to get messy, but I will try to keep it simple. So what you're seeing is a timeline for about 2 years, different things, and what actually was happening on this field. So in the winter 22, he had rye planted, and then rye was chopped, and his yield was 8 tons per acre. Going into summer, this is where corn was planted, and it was silage, so it's 28 tons per acre in 23. Going into winter again, triticale, that what was planted and then used as silage. Last summer, he also had corn silage, and then this year, triticale is planted. So if you look at a rotation, it's rye, corn, triticale, corn, but all silage. We're talking about that field. And what you're seeing is different amounts of nitrogen added, UAN, manure, there's the lagoon water that's added over a period of time. So let's look at the total nitrogen added, and we're interested in this one right now because we have the most soil data that corresponds with. So about 200 pounds per acre, and then here. So the recommendation is using is actually our recommendation. So he's doing a really nice job because he's adding at different places. You see this, and he's also adding in different time periods, split applications. So following all the recommendations that we have so far. So let's look at, with this application, if you go into the field in different places, where would you find the nitrogen and where was it? So the three things we're looking at: a corn biomass, which is the plant part, and then also cover crop will be rye or triticale, and the grain will be corn grain if there was any, right? So if we look in winter, it's kind of hard to see those dots, but on this screen, you see the yellow band, right? So that's where the rye was. This is nitrogen %, how much was there. I'm going to just flip. Then you have triticale, again, the yellow band, and then this year triticale again. So one point I want to make is when you're looking at nitrogen, it depends when you take the sample. Usually most of the plants, if you take early sample, it will have high nitrogen than later, and it's because of the movement from plant to other places. Like, so if we go in 23, here we are looking at a corn plant, and you see in the beginning, in July, we had much higher, then it declined. And this is very typical, like in all corn plants, because of the movement from plant to the grain part of corn. Like again, in the summer, we see very typical pattern, higher in the beginning and declines. So what that means is if you're taking a sample, to know that, you're not going to know that. There's a high variability, and that's why you need a lot of data. That's why coming back to, if I could, I will take sample every day to put together the story of what's actually going on. So we're relying on few data points, even though we are collecting a lot of data that most people don't have access to or don't do that. What about grain? So one thing was that nitrogen in the grain is pretty stable over a period of time once the grain forms, because there's no need for more nitrogen to get in, and it doesn't get out. Okay, what about phosphorus and potassium? I know you all love phosphorus here, so I thought I will throw a slide here. So I'm just going to flip through. Like, phosphorus and potassium are very similar to nitrogen, and these nutrients behave sort of very similarly. Again, it high in the beginning, and then it declines, so on, right? So what about the residue? That's a very important part. So we also have no-till systems. We also have cover crops. Like, so it can contribute a lot of nitrogen. What I'm going to show is, if you have rye, for example, what will be the nitrogen in the residue. So if you look here, that's your rye residue. What about triticale? So what we are finding is that triticale residue actually has more nitrogen. And that has an implication because it means there could potentially be more nitrogen available to corn if you have triticale. So that's the early observation, and that's something we know from the literature. It's not a new finding. What was different was in 2023, we had 8 inches more rainfall. So there's another, if you have more rainfall, that's also challenging, which means it can also leach your nitrogen from the soil system. So everything is connected in different ways. Having less rainfall sometimes is not good, but it can also be good because your nitrogen is not going to leach or run off from the field. So it depends when that happens. But here there was an irrigation, so probably that helped to some extent. But could this difference be because we have less rain? Maybe. We don't have that data and determination yet, but that's something we're very interested in sort of figuring out. What about phosphorus and potassium? I'm just going to flip that. So what we see is similar to nitrogen. We also see phosphorus is also high in triticale residue. When we look at potassium, it's not very different because if you think about potassium, most of that is in the plant, in the stalk, in the leaves and straw. And if you are removing as a part of silage, then you also taking that away from the field. How I'm doing on time?
You got 12 minutes.
Okay, we'll be done in few. Okay, so this is an interesting, so other thing we've been sort of messing around was now in the soil. So if I were to go 1 foot deep in the soil, how much nitrogen is there? Because that gets back to our original question that we are asking, is there enough nitrogen in the soil to feed corn? Right? That's the question we were interested in. So here is all the soil sampling that's done in April, July, August, September, different places. And you're seeing these different colors. So nitrogen in the soil exists in different forms. For example, if you're adding UAN, that's urea, ammonia, and nitrate. If you go in the soil and you analyze, you can also see how much is ammonia, how much is nitrate. And urea is hard to determine because it's part of what's called soluble organic P, or here I'm calling DON. All the residues, when they decompose, they also contribute. So to simplify, there are 3 forms main that exist in the field. One is what you added with fertilizers, and what you're going to see here is this is when fertilizer and manure was added. So this blue area, which was in this case nitrate, increased, but didn't increase that much because it's very quickly cycled back and forth in the soil. What happened after, so in this case, triticale was planted, and then more fertilizer, and so there's a slight increase in it. So the point here is that everything is in flux, everything is changing, and microbes are the one who was sort of causing this nitrogen chemistry to change. If it was phosphorus, it will be very simple. It's all there in the soil, and it doesn't get influenced as much. So to take the message back, what we're learning here is this is how many pounds. Here is like 1 kilo will be 0.9 pounds, so this will 100 will be 90 pounds, for example. So if we go on these different 5-time intervals, we are finding there is enough nitrogen available to grow corn silage in this example. And again, reminding you here about the daily uptake is really tiny, 1 to 3 pounds. So there's a lot of nitrogen in this field in different places. And we see that when every time you apply nitrogen, it quickly increases the soil nitrogen. And based on our findings or case study from this field, we think there was enough nitrogen present in the soil at different places. And again, in this case, corn silage yield was 28 tons. Nitrogen was applied according to the recommended rates. So one thing that we are very interested in that, and we're going to explore that with MDA, will be, it's a hypothetical question, that on this field, if our farmer added 20 pounds less nitrogen, could he have gotten the same yield? We don't know the answer, but that's something we're very interested in, because if it wouldn't, it will serve many purposes. Less fertilizer application, less cost, and also less loss to the environment. So we are very interested in exploring that question further. Okay, so now you saw all different ones. What if you look at the proportion, like the percent of total? The point here I want to make is that soil nitrogen pool is dominated by what's called organic pool. And because everything is transformed, residue decomposing, manure decomposing, cover crops. So that's the main dominant form that exists. When you add fertilizer, and if you're able to sample quickly after that application, you can see how that number increase. Here is sort of blue and red. And again, it increases very quickly, which is quickly used by plants, or rapidly mineralized. So even if we ignore all the organic part in this field, which we know becomes soluble, there was enough nitrate and ammonium present in the field. And this is not saying that farmer is doing anything wrong. He's following our recommendations, and he's doing really, actually good job. Also split applications, and it's just amazing to see that. So let's conclude. What are we saying? So we're limited. I want to caution that we are just exploring that. This is one case study. We have many other case studies to explore, and the project will be going on for the next few years to look at that question. Do we need to change our recommendations, or are we happy with the way we are doing? That's one. And what I can suggest you right now is keep following your nutrient management plan and our recommendations. They are pretty good. If you are more risk taker, you want to reduce your nitrogen application by 5%, you probably could. And if you get less yield, I will buy you coffee. How's that? And donuts, maybe? No, Jenny will get donuts. Right? So again, this is a really good idea. Split application, do pre-plant, band, and side dress if you have the capability and equipment to do so. So think about this analogy that if you're doing a split application versus all the application, is contractor. If you pay everything to them in the beginning, you know what happens, right? So follow that analogy. And again, MDA has been a great supporter for us with this project, and we continue to collaborate in different avenues. We also had support from USDA. But more importantly, I want to thank all the farmers in state of Maryland. And I tell that as I go along, that every time we have reached a farmer that we want to do something on their field, they have said, come over. So, which is unprecedented. So hats off to all of you who are working with us to help you better.